Welcome everyone to another installment of Mondays with Mundy. That's me, Jim Mundy, historian for the Union League Legacy Foundation at the Union League of Philadelphia in Center City. I am intentionally recording this on April the 12th because it is the 159th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War, April the 12th of 1861. Some other events happened in April in the 1860s that are equally important. So on April the 9th of 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. 5 days after that, John Wilkes Booth went into American history books as the assassin of Abraham Lincoln, whom he shot on April the 14th of 1865 at Ford's Theater. So here's a bit of the story. Because in the collection at the Union League, stewarded by the Legacy Foundation, is a document called the Tanner Manuscript, perhaps one of the most unique items in American history. And here's the story behind that. So Corporal James Tanner was in the 87th New York Regiment, a young boy of 17 when he joined in 1861, survived all the battles until the second day of the Battle of Bull Run, August the 30th of 1862, when, lying on the ground, his regiment was under an artillery bombardment. A Confederate shell fragment basically severed his legs below his knees. He was not mortally wounded. He would survive and eventually find his way back to his home in Richmondville, New York, in Schoharie County, about 60 miles west of Albany. And it was there that he would recover and obtain a new occupation. He would go to the Ames School of Business in Syracuse and become a stenographer, as we would think of them today. And with that skill, he would go back to Washington, D.C., and ironically get a job in the Ordnance Department, which, that's how he lost his legs. And he would live in an apartment next to the Peterson House, which was across the street from Ford's Theater. Now, we all know what happened there, right? On April 14th of 1865, at 10:05 at night, John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's unconscious body was taken across the street to the Peterson House, which, like a Philadelphia row home, had a central hallway, actually on the right-hand side, and then it had a front parlor off the left, a back parlor, and a rear bedroom. And it was the rear bedroom where Lincoln lay dying. Now, it was about midnight that Secretary of War Edwin McMaster Stanton, who at this point is in charge of Washington, D.C., right? First it's the president, Abraham Lincoln, but he's mortally wounded. Andrew Johnson was not available. He was, in theory, at his hotel room, but nobody could find him, couldn't get him up, whatever. And then third in line was William Seward, the Secretary of State, who actually was attacked by an assassin at the same time that Lincoln was being shot, in theory. And he was wounded in his bed, though he would recover himself. So fourth in line was Stanton. And Stanton was very much a type A personality, take charge kind of guy, and Lincoln's most trusted cabinet member. And beginning at midnight, Stanton decided he would interrogate eyewitnesses to the assassination in the Peterson House. And he began doing that by taking the recordings in longhand. And obviously that wasn't going to work very well. And so they sent out a call for someone who could take stenography. And it just so happened that Tanner was leaning out of his front room window when the call went out. And he answered it, hobbled down the stairs on his prosthetic legs into the Peterson House, where for approximately an hour and a half, between midnight and 1:30 in the morning, he would record the eyewitness testimony of 8 people. One who saw Seward's assassin leaving his house on Lafayette Square, and then the other 7 people who were in Ford's Theater who saw John Wilkes Booth shoot Abraham Lincoln. And this would be forever known as the Tanner Manuscript. Right? So Tanner wrote everything down in shorthand, right, on miscellaneous pieces of paper, and didn't leave the Peterson House at all, actually. He stayed there, and after the interrogations were ended, and he would transcribe his notes into longhand, right? So they would be legible, people could understand what he had written down and what he'd heard. Now, he was only 21 years old at the time. It must have been an amazing sensation to be that young in a room where you're listening to people talk about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. But Tanner pulled through, and Tanner did a heck of a job. So Tanner was still in the Peterson House, at 7:22, actually in the bedroom when Lincoln died that morning. So Tanner would go back to his apartment next door, and looking at his longhand transcription, he decided he didn't like it and wanted to create a better copy, which he did. And it was that second copy that he took to Stanton's office, the War Department, and left with a clerk, and that copy would eventually disappear. Tanner was able to keep his original shorthand and longhand copies, and after all, this is 1865. So 40 years ago by. It is 1905, April of 1905, and the Washington Post, in an article asked, is anybody still around who was there to that momentous night in American history? And Tanner said, not only was I there, this is what I have. And it was at that point we believed that one of Tanner's sons, because after the war he got married and had 4 children, but his son James A. Tanner would take his father's shorthand and longhand notes, glue them on sheets of linen, and have them bound together, thus creating the manuscript. All right? Now, that manuscript would stay in the Tanner family until 1917, when Tanner, who over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries had become familiar with the Union League of Philadelphia, because Tanner was very much involved in Civil War veterans' benefits and things like that. And the League was very concerned about Civil War veterans themselves. And many of them were veterans, actually. And so Tanner discovered that the League was going to dedicate a Lincoln Memorial Room on November 24th of 1917. And upon hearing that, he voluntarily mailed the League his copy, the only copy of this eyewitness testimony, knowing that the League would value it, appreciate it, cherish it, and take good care of it, which the League has done all these years. And it is now, and this Tanner manuscript still exists, and it is still a remarkably unique document in American history. And though I'm recording this from home, and I couldn't get the original copy, as you can imagine, I do have a facsimile copy that was published by the League back in the 1970s. So I'm going to read to you an excerpt from that. And this is the testimony of James Ferguson. Now, James Ferguson owned the Greenback Saloon, which was on the north side of Ford's Theater, which was on 10th Street in Washington, D.C. All right. And Ferguson was a big fan of U.S. Grant, and when he'd heard that morning that the Lincolns had invited the Grants to be their guests at the theater that night, Ferguson got 2 tickets. But here's the story itself. I think it'll be self-explanatory. Mr. Ford came to me today about 1 or 2 o'clock and told me that my favorite General Grant was going to be present at the theater tonight and had secured a box. I went in the theater and engaged seats 58 and 59 on the opposite side from the President's box. So if you're in Ford's Theater and you're staring at the stage, the President's box is on the right-hand side, 12 feet high off the stage. Ferguson is on the left-hand side, 12 feet off, looking directly across the stage at the Lincoln box. When the President came in, I saw that General Grant was not with him, but I still kept watching the box, expecting General Grant to come in, knowing that if he came in, he would go in the same box with the President. After the curtain went up for the 3rd act, I saw Mr. Booth go to the door leading to the passage of the private box which the President occupied and try the door. In a moment afterward, I was looking with an opera glass to see who the citizen was that was with the President. I then heard the report of the pistol and saw Mrs. Lincoln catch him around the neck, that is her husband. I saw him, that is Abraham Lincoln, throw up his right arm, and at the same time I saw Booth move his hand to his side and pull a knife and move between Mrs. Lincoln and a lady in the same box. He, that is Booth, put his hands on the cushion of the box and threw his feet right over. As he jumped over, he pulled part of a state flag off and had part of it under his feet when he fell to the stage. The very moment he struck, he exclaimed, "Sic semper tyrannis." As he came across the stage, facing me, he looked me right up in the face, and it alarmed me, and I pulled the lady who was with me down behind the banister. I looked right down at him, and he stopped as he says, "I have done it," and he shook the knife. And at that point, Booth would run off stage, jump on his horse in Baptist Alley, and would meet his own death 11 days later in the tobacco barn on the Garrett farmhouse in Port Royal, Virginia. But that's not where the story ends, because it would keep on going and going and going. So the League has had this document these many years and taken very good care of it. We know the major figures in the tragedy: Abraham Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth perhaps even, but there's another figure, if you will, that was also part of the tragedy itself, and that was Major Henry Rathbone, because Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée were the guests of the Lincolns that night at Ford's Theater. Now, Major Rathbone was further away from Abraham Lincoln when Booth walked into the box and shot Lincoln behind his left ear with a Derringer made here in Philadelphia, ironically enough. Right? Rathbone couldn't stop Booth from shooting Lincoln, but he tried to stop him from jumping over onto the stage. But he couldn't, because at that point Booth took that knife that you just heard about and stabbed Rathbone in the left arm between his elbow and his shoulder. And Rathbone eventually would faint from the loss of blood. But Rathbone and Clara Harris survived, but the night was seared into Rathbone's memory. Now, they would marry in 1867 and have 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. But Rathbone's mental conditions didn't improve at all, and he was always haunted by that night, thinking perhaps that he could have stopped Booth from killing Abraham Lincoln. Rathbone resigned from the Army in 1870, held a series of jobs until 1882, when U.S. President Chester Arthur appointed him as the U.S. Consul General in the province of Hanover in Germany. And it was there that Rathbone, with his family, his 2 boys and his girls, where Rathbone would have perhaps his last delusional fit, because on December 23rd of 1883, he would attempt to kill his family. He shot and stabbed his wife to death, she while trying to protect her children. The children were not harmed. Rathbone was captured, was tried at a German court and convicted of murder, and was sentenced to an insane asylum where he lived the rest of his life until he died in 1917. So perhaps he is the last of the many tragic figures that played a part in this great play, because it was a play. It was a set piece planned by John Wilkes Booth. Because what was Booth? Who was Booth? Booth was one of the greatest Shakespearean actors in American theatrical history. He was from the most famous family of Shakespearean actors. All right? And it was Lincoln's fondness for the theater that took him to Ford's Theater that night on April the 14th. And Lincoln was very much familiar with Shakespeare, could quote Shakespeare, actually. So let's use the Shakespeare analogy here. So if Abraham Lincoln is at the theater, John Wilkes Booth, the great Shakespearean actor, is going to play who? Name one of the great villains in any Shakespearean play. Who would that be? Well, how about Brutus? And what is the play? Julius Caesar. So John Wilkes Booth on April the 14th played his last and greatest Shakespearean role as Brutus to Abraham Lincoln's Julius Caesar, because John Wilkes Booth wanted to rid the Republic of the tyrant Abraham Lincoln. And that is the story. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned more about that night in American history. You can Google all the major characters in it. You can Google James Tanner as well and learn about Manuscript, which is at the Union League as I speak. And periodically we bring it out on view. And if you should visit the Union League sometime, if you ever have the chance, make arrangements beforehand, perhaps to see it. We'll see what happens. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and we will see you next week. Goodbye.